The encounter. The stars above the alien city of Kalyth shimmered in unnatural hues, their glow refracting through the towering crystalline spires that stretched toward the heavens like frozen waves of glass. The city itself pulsed with life. Hovering transports drifted between skyscrapers of smooth onyx-like material, while luminescent flora wound their way up the structures, casting eerie yet beautiful bioluminescent light upon the streets below. Nia Erisdahl stepped off the diplomatic shuttle, her boots clicking against the polished obsidian platform of the Serkthari Council Hall. Around her, the air thrummed with an energy she couldn't quite place, a presence, an awareness, as if the very city was observing her. Her heart pounded, but she kept her posture straight. This mission was too important for hesitation. The Serkthari, a dominant species in this sector, were on the brink of war with humanity. Their empire was vast, their minds sharp, but their race had evolved in a way that had long suppressed emotion. For them, passion was disorder. Feelings were a disease. They operated on logic, calculation, and precision. And yet here she was, a human, a creature of raw emotion, standing before them, tasked with forging peace where none had existed before. The towering gates of the council hall slid open with a whisper, revealing a vast chamber carved from dark stone, its walls inlaid with veins of glowing silver. Tall figures stood in formation at the far end, their faces obscured by the intricate, bone-white masks that all Serkthari diplomats wore. Their robes shimmered with threads of dark violet and obsidian, reflecting the cold authority they wielded. Nia strode forward, her breath measured, her gaze unwavering. She would not bow. She was here as an equal. A deep, resonant voice broke the silence. Human. The word was spoken with a clipped, precise articulation, devoid of warmth. The Serkthari who had spoken stepped forward, and for the first time, Nia met the eyes of Lorran Threx. He was tall, even for his species, his angular features almost too perfect, sculpted, symmetrical, eerily beautiful in a way that unsettled and intrigued her at once. His skin had a faint iridescence, catching the chamber's glow in shifting patterns of silver and violet. But it was his eyes that held her, the color of liquid amethyst, sharp as cut crystal, and utterly unreadable. The silence stretched, tension weaving itself into the very air between them. You stand here, unarmed, expecting our trust. Lorran's voice was smooth, controlled, yet there was something beneath it, something she couldn't quite place. Nia lifted her chin. Trust is built, not demanded. Her voice was steady. I believe in dialogue over weapons. The council shifted, almost imperceptibly, their masked faces unreadable, yet she could sense their disapproval. To them, humans were reckless creatures, governed by impulse, unworthy of equal footing in diplomatic matters. Lorran studied her in silence. We have observed your kind, he said at last. You are ruled by emotions. Love, anger, grief, distractions, weaknesses. Nia allowed a small, knowing smile. Or strengths. Depends on the perspective. The council murmured, barely audible, but Lorran remained still. His gaze had not left her. She could feel his scrutiny, peeling back her composure, testing her resolve. Your species clings to the concept of love, Lorran mused, as if it is more than mere biochemical response. But tell me, human, what power does love truly hold? Can it shield you in battle? Can it turn aside a blade? Can it command the stars? Nia took a slow, measured step forward. Yes. For the first time, something flickered in Lorran's expression, too fleeting to decipher. Explain. His tone was firm, but quieter now. She took a breath, feeling the weight of their gazes, but she did not waver. Love is not just emotion. It's a force. It drives people to defy impossible odds. It fuels sacrifice. It turns strangers into family, enemies into allies. It has shaped history. Entire civilizations rise and fall because of it. She met his gaze unwaveringly. You claim it is weakness. I say it is the most powerful force in existence. The chamber fell into silence. Even the other council members, so detached and indifferent, seemed to pause at her words. Lorran exhaled, slow and deliberate. Intriguing. Nia knew she had sparked something. A curiosity, a crack in the perfect armor of Serkthari logic. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. I did not come here to debate philosophy, she continued. I came for peace. Your people are at the precipice of war with mine. You think we are volatile, unpredictable. But what if our emotions are the very thing that can bridge this divide? She took another step forward, bold despite the danger. You do not need to understand us to work with us. But you will need to trust us, and I am willing to prove that trust, here and now. Lorran's amethyst gaze lingered on her a second longer before he spoke. Very well, Nia Erisdahl. Her name on his lips sent an odd shiver down her spine. We shall see if your species' devotion to sentiment is worth our time. He gestured toward the council table. Sit. We will listen. A breath she hadn't realized she was holding slipped past her lips. She had passed the first barrier, but something told her that Lorran Threx would be the greatest challenge of them all. As she moved to take her seat, she could still feel his gaze on her, not just studying her, but searching for something. And Nia had the strange, exhilarating feeling that she was about to change more than just the course of a war. She might just change him. A fragile bond. The days that followed blurred into a delicate balance of diplomacy and tension, as Nia Erisdahl navigated the intricate corridors of the Serkthari Council Hall. The negotiations were grueling. Every word she spoke was dissected. Every argument she made was met with cold calculation. Yet, amid the skepticism and resistance, one thing became clear. Lorran Threx was always watching her. It wasn't just observation. It was scrutiny, curiosity, something deeper that neither of them dared to name. At first, his questions were pointed, surgical in their precision, designed to unearth the flaws in human logic. You claim emotion is a strength, yet history shows your kind has waged wars over mere sentiment. If love is so powerful, why has it not prevented destruction? Nia leaned forward, her amber eyes unwavering. Because love does not erase pain, Lorran. It does not guarantee peace, but it is the reason we fight for something better. Love makes sacrifice meaningful. It gives us something to live for beyond survival. Lorran had no answer for that, but his silence told her that he was thinking, truly thinking, perhaps for the first time in his life, about something outside the rigid constructs of his people's doctrine. A glimpse of humanity. One evening, after another grueling session with the council, Nia found herself standing on one of the many open-air terraces of Kalyth's council spire. The alien skyline stretched before her, awash in the bioluminescent glow of the city's flora. The sky was a deep violet, streaked with shifting bands of teal and gold, the colors of a distant nebula that never set. She heard the soft, nearly soundless approach of Lorran before she saw him. You linger, he observed, stepping beside her, his sharp gaze shifting toward the alien stars. Yeah, Nia exhaled, letting the moments settle between them. Needed a break from being dissected like a specimen. Lorran's lips barely curled, not quite a smile, but something close. You held your own. Of course, she said, turning to look at him. I'm human. We're stubborn like that. There was a moment of silence, not uncomfortable but charged. She watched as his fingers flexed slightly against the edge of the railing, as if testing the sensation of the smooth, cool stone beneath them. You enjoy this? He asked suddenly. This stillness, this act of simply existing. Nia tilted her head at him, studying the way his expression remained carefully neutral, but his eyes betrayed something else. Uncertainty, intrigue, perhaps even longing. You've never just stood somewhere and enjoyed a moment? She asked. Lorran hesitated. Moments exist to serve a function. To act without purpose is inefficient. Nia let out a soft, breathy laugh, shaking her head. God, you Serkthari are missing out. His gaze flickered to her at the sound of her laughter, and for a brief second, she swore she saw something raw, something vulnerable, flash across his face before he turned away. "I have studied humanity for years," he said, "observed your species across different colonies, yet never have I encountered one who speaks as you do." "Because you've been looking at reports and data," she countered. "But people aren't equations, Lorran. We aren't meant to be analyzed like variables in a formula. We're meant to be felt." Lorran's jaw tightened. "I do not feel." "Maybe not," she allowed. "But you listen. That's a start." He did not respond, but he also did not leave. They stood together beneath the alien sky, and in that fragile quiet, something unspoken settled between them. The warning. The next day, tensions in the council grew. A faction of Serkthari purists, elders who viewed humanity as an unstable threat, were gaining ground. Their leader, High Chancellor Valen, was growing impatient, his voice dripping with disdain every time he addressed Nia. "You waste our time, human," Valen sneered. "Your words are meaningless. Your species is reckless, bound by its own chaos. Why should we gamble the future of the Serkthari on your erratic emotions?" Nia stood firm, even as she felt the weight of the council's skepticism pressing against her. "Because peace is the only path where both our people survive," she said. "You see emotion as weakness, but I see it as understanding. We don't need to be the same to coexist." A scoff from the council, the dismissive wave. And then, a voice she didn't expect to speak. "Lorran. She is not wrong." The entire chamber fell into stunned silence as Lorran Threx, the council's most revered diplomat, defended her. Valen's gaze sharpened. "You tread dangerous ground, Threx." But Lorran remained unshaken. "A civilization that refuses to adapt is doomed to stagnation. The human offers a perspective that may benefit us. To dismiss her is to act out of fear, not reason." Nia turned her gaze to him, something unspoken passing between them. He had taken her side, in a room where doing so could cost him everything. Valen's expression darkened, but he said nothing more, for now. As the meeting adjourned, Lorran turned to Nia. "You should be careful," he said quietly. "You are making enemies." She smirked. "So are you." Something unreadable flickered across his face. Then, to her shock, he said, "Walk with me." The fractured mask. They walked through the dimly lit corridors of the council halls, away from prying eyes. Nia stole a glance at him, noting the way his usually unshaken composure seemed frayed at the edges. "You took a risk back there," she said softly. "I calculated that your perspective was worth defending." "That wasn't calculation," she countered. "That was conviction." Lorran hesitated, his steps slowing. For a moment, the carefully constructed walls around him seemed to crack, just a fraction. "It is difficult," he admitted at last, the words tasting foreign in his mouth. "To speak against what I have always known. To question." She reached out before she could stop herself, her fingers lightly grazing his wrist. He stiffened. Contact was rare among Serkthari, but he didn't pull away. "You're allowed to question," she murmured. "That's what makes us grow." For the first time, his voice was almost quiet. "And if I no longer recognize myself in the process." Nia's heart clenched at the rare vulnerability in his tone. "Then maybe," she whispered, "you're finally becoming who you were always meant to be." The air between them thickened, charged with something neither of them dared name. And as Lorran looked at her, truly looked at her, Nia had the overwhelming sense that she was standing on the precipice of something far greater than diplomacy. Perhaps, she realized with a shiver, she had been from the moment she met him. The tension between Nia and Lorran only grew in the days that followed, an invisible thread connecting them, even as they fought to ignore it. The diplomatic meetings continued, but the weight of opposition from the Serkthari High Council bore down on them both. High Chancellor Valen had made it clear that humans were tolerated only because they were necessary. Peace was a tactical advantage, nothing more. But for Lorran, it had become something else. He found himself lingering on Nia's words long after she had left the chamber. Her arguments stayed with him, circling in his mind like a star caught in a gravity well. He had spent his entire life suppressing the stirrings of emotion, trained from birth to operate with logic and efficiency. Yet now, when he was alone, he felt restless in a way he could not define. Her voice haunted his thoughts, the way her eyes burned with conviction, the way her presence disrupted the very foundation of everything he knew to be true. It was irrational. It was dangerous. And yet, when he stood before the council, he found himself speaking not from detached reasoning, but from something else, something dangerously close to belief. Nia, on the other hand, had no such illusions about the dangers she faced. The hostility in the council was growing sharper, the murmurs of distrust turning into something far more insidious. More than once, she had noticed the way certain members spoke in hushed tones when she entered a room, how conversations shifted the moment she walked past. The purest faction within the Serkthari was gaining strength, and she could feel the undercurrents of something dark forming beneath the surface. One night, as she sat alone in her quarters aboard the diplomatic vessel, reviewing the latest reports, her comm device flickered with an incoming message. She expected another summons from the council, but when the screen activated, it was not an official order. It was a warning. The message was brief, but the implications were clear. Leave Kalyth. You are not safe here. Her stomach tightened, but she did not look away. She had expected this. From the moment she had set foot on Serkthari soil, she had known she was stepping into dangerous territory. But she could not leave now. Not when she was so close. Not when there was still a chance to bridge the divide between their species. The next day, she found herself walking through the shadowed corridors of the council halls, deep in thought. That was when she felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. She turned sharply, scanning the passageway, but there was no one. Just the eerie silence of the ancient structure. A cold chill traced down her spine, but she forced herself to move forward. When she rounded the next corner, she nearly collided with Lorran. For the first time since she had met him, he looked different, his usual composure disrupted by something she couldn't immediately place. His violet eyes were sharp, but there was a tension in his posture, something barely restrained beneath the surface. "You need to leave," he said without preamble. Nia blinked at him. "Excuse me." "The purest faction is making their move," he continued, his voice low and urgent. "You are not safe here anymore. If you remain, they will act." She stared at him, searching his face for any hint of hesitation. There was none. "And what do you suggest I do?" "Run away. Let them win." "This is not a game, Nia," he said, stepping closer. "This is survival." Her breath caught slightly at the way he said her name, so unlike the clinical detachment he usually spoke with. He had always referred to her as human in council meetings, reinforcing the divide between them. But now, here in the quiet corridor, he had abandoned formality. It was personal now. "I can't leave Lorran," she said firmly. "If I go now, everything we've worked for falls apart. The treaty, the negotiations, it will all be for nothing." His jaw tightened. "If you stay, you may not live to see it completed." She let out a shaky breath, torn between reason and resolve. But before she could reply, an alarm blared through the corridor, shattering the tension between them. Lorran's expression darkened. Without a word, he grabbed her wrist, pulling her into the shadows just as a group of Serkthari guards stormed down the hall, their weapons drawn. Nia barely had time to process the danger before she felt the sharp press of cold metal against her back. Lorran had pushed her against the wall, shielding her from view with his body. For a moment, all she could hear was the sound of their breathing, the rhythmic pounding of her own heart as the guards passed by. Lorran remained still, his grip firm but careful, his body close enough that she could feel the controlled tension radiating from him. When the guards finally disappeared around the corner, he exhaled, releasing his hold on her. "They're moving faster than I anticipated," he muttered. They're going to act tonight. Then we need to stop them, Nia said, straightening. He turned to her, something flickering in his gaze. You are determined to make this difficult. She gave a small, humorless smile. I thought you would have figured that out by now. For a second, just a second, something like amusement crossed his face. But then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by the steel-edged focus of a man about to make a dangerous decision. Come with me, he said. She hesitated. Where? Somewhere they won't find you. For a moment, she considered resisting. She wasn't the type to hide. But the urgency in his voice, the warning that had come earlier, and the undeniable sense of danger all told her that if she refused, she wouldn't live to see the next sunrise. So she followed him. They moved swiftly through the darkened halls, avoiding the main corridors, taking paths that only Lorran seemed to know. He led her through a hidden passage at the back of the council hall, past a series of security checkpoints that, strangely, no longer seemed active. She glanced at him, noting how easily he bypassed them, as if he had planned for this. You've been preparing for this, she realized. He didn't answer immediately, but then, with the faintest exhale, he admitted, I knew it would come to this. I did not know it would be so soon. They emerged onto another terrace, but this one was not like the open walkways of the council chambers. It was hidden, enclosed by towering crystalline structures, a place where no one could see them from the city below. Lorran turned to her. You will stay here. I will deal with the purists. She crossed her arms. You think I'm just going to sit here while you risk your life? Yes, he said simply. Because if you die, everything ends. She opened her mouth to argue, but then he did something unexpected. He reached out, fingers brushing against hers for the briefest moment. It wasn't much, barely a touch, but in Serkthari culture, it was everything. She inhaled sharply as realization struck. You're afraid, she whispered. Lorran's expression remained impassive, but his fingers lingered against hers just a moment longer before he finally pulled away. I do not fear for myself, he said quietly. Only for you. Then, without another word, he turned and disappeared into the night. Nia stood there, heart pounding, as the weight of his words settled over her. Lorran Threx, the man who did not feel, had just told her, without speaking the words, that he did. The night was restless. Nia sat against the cool, crystalline walls of the hidden terrace, her mind racing. She had spent years in negotiations, learning how to read people, understanding the weight of every word, every pause. But nothing had prepared her for the way Lorran had looked at her before he left. There had been no flourish, no dramatic declaration, just a brief, fleeting moment when his fingers had brushed against hers, when his voice had softened just enough to betray what he would never say aloud. She was more than a diplomat to him now. She was a weakness. The realization should have terrified her. Instead, it sent a shiver down her spine for an entirely different reason. A distant explosion broke her thoughts. Her breath caught as she rushed to the edge of the terrace, staring out into the alien city below. Fires flickered along the lower levels, casting a strange orange glow against the otherwise luminous blues and purples of Kalyth's skyline. Another explosion erupted from a distant spire, and then the alarms rang out, piercing, shrill tones that sent the entire city into motion. The purists had begun their attack. She had to move. Without hesitation, she sprinted toward the exit Lorran had used, ignoring the risk. He had told her to stay put, had likely thought she would listen. But Lorran Threx still didn't fully understand humans. Nia would never sit still while someone fought her battles for her. She navigated through the darkened corridors, avoiding patrols where she could, ducking behind towering structures of translucent stone that cast jagged shadows under the flickering emergency lights. The Serkthari were methodical in their combat, precise, calculated. If the purists were acting now, it meant they believed they had already won. That was their first mistake. The council chambers were in chaos by the time she arrived. The once pristine hall had been thrown into disarray. Council members shouted over one another, guards scrambled to take defensive positions, and at the center of it all stood Lorran. His violet eyes burned with intensity as he addressed the council, his voice unwavering even as the chamber cracked around him. "You waste time," he said, his tone edged with steel. "While you argue, the purists move forward. If we do not act now, there will be no council left to deliberate over treaties." Vaylin, ever the calculating force of opposition, sneered at him from across the room. "You presume to lecture us, Threx. We should have known you would side with the humans." Nia saw the way Lorran's shoulders tensed at the insult, but his expression remained impassive. "I side with reason. You cling to the past while the future burns around you." Before Vaylin could retort, the chamber doors burst open. Nia barely had time to react before a group of Serkthari purist enforcers stormed in, their weapons humming with lethal energy. Chaos erupted. Blaster fire illuminated the room in pulses of violent blue and red, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. Nia dove behind the nearest column as the first wave of energy blasts struck the council's protective barriers, sending ripples of distorted air cascading through the room. She had no weapon, no armor. She was a diplomat caught in the crossfire of a war she had tried to prevent. But she had one advantage: Lorran. He moved like a specter through the chaos, his reflexes terrifyingly precise, as he intercepted the first purist soldier with an elegant, brutal efficiency. His blade, a sleek, obsidian-hued weapon that vibrated at an almost imperceptible frequency, sliced through armor as if it were air. Nia barely had time to comprehend what she was witnessing. She had known Lorran as a diplomat, a tactician, a scholar of war. But this was something else entirely. He fought with the precision of a man who had never lost a battle. And then, in the midst of the carnage, his gaze met hers. He hesitated, only for a fraction of a second. But in a battle where seconds decided life or death, it was long enough. A purist soldier seized the opportunity. Nia saw the movement before Lorran did. Her body moved before her mind could catch up. She threw herself forward, colliding with Lorran just as the energy blast tore through the space he had been standing in. The force of the impact sent them both sprawling to the ground, and for a moment, everything blurred. The sounds, the movement, the chaos. Then, a sharp pain shot through her side. Lorran was the first to react. His hands were on her before she could fully register the burning sensation blooming across her ribs. "You fool," he hissed, his voice uncharacteristically raw as he pressed against the wound to staunch the bleeding. Nia let out a strangled laugh, despite the pain. "You hesitate, you die. Isn't that your whole philosophy?" His grip tightened. "Not when it comes to you." The words were barely more than a whisper, but she heard them, felt them. For a moment, the battle faded into the background, drowned out by the thundering of her own heartbeat. Lorran Threx, the Serkthari diplomat, the man who had spent his life denying the power of emotion, had just shattered his own doctrine. And he had done it for her, but there was no time to dwell on it. The purists were regrouping, and they would not make the same mistakes twice. Lorran hauled her to her feet, one arm steadying her as he turned to the remaining council members. "You must evacuate. Now." Vaylin sneered and abandoned the council chambers. "We will not." "You will if you want to live," Lorran interrupted, his voice like thunder. "You are politicians, not warriors. If you stay here, you die." Vaylin hesitated, but the logic was irrefutable. The remaining council members reluctantly followed his lead as he guided them toward the emergency exits. Nia leaned heavily against him, her vision swimming, but she refused to slow down. "Don't," she started, her voice weak. Lorran glanced down at her. "Don't what?" "Don't carry me if I pass out." She gritted her teeth through the pain. "Bad optics." A ghost of a smirk flickered across his face, but it was gone just as quickly. "You are insufferable. You're just figuring that out." But despite her attempt at levity, She could see the way his jaw clenched, the way his fingers pressed just a little tighter against her wound, as if he could will it to stop bleeding through sheer force alone. They had survived the first wave. But the war was just beginning. The corridors of the council chambers blurred into streaks of dark stone and flickering emergency lights as Lorran half-dragged, half-carried Nia through the chaos. Behind them, the sounds of battle raged on. Blaster fire, the sharp clash of energy blades, the cries of wounded council members and guards alike. The purists had underestimated the resistance, but they were relentless, and the city was still burning. Nia's breath came in short, uneven gasps, each step jarring the wound in her side. She clenched her teeth, refusing to let weakness slow her down. Pain could be ignored. What mattered was getting out alive. "You're bleeding too much," Lorran said, his voice a low growl of frustration as he pressed a hand against the wound. "You should not have done that." She gave him a half-smirk, even as her vision swam. "Saved your life. You're welcome." His jaw tightened. "You are reckless." "You hesitated," she countered, her words sharper than they should have been. "You." Her breath hitched as a fresh wave of pain lanced through her. "You can fight like a machine, Lorran, but you still don't understand what it means to fight for someone." Lorran said nothing, his grip on her arm tightening as he pulled her into a concealed passage. The emergency exit routes were still functional, though it was clear that the purists had locked down most of the major escape points. The war had begun before negotiations could be finalized, and now everything hung by a thread. He activated the passage's locking mechanism, sealing them inside a narrow corridor lined with ancient metallic conduits pulsing with dim blue energy. For the first time since the fighting started, there was silence. Nia slumped against the wall, closing her eyes for a brief second, trying to steady her breathing. She felt Lorran kneel beside her, his touch surprisingly gentle as he examined the wound. "This will not heal on its own," he muttered. "I need to. Just patch me up enough to move," she cut in. "We don't have time for a full medical procedure." Lorran exhaled sharply, his frustration clear, but he didn't argue. He pulled a small vial from within his robes, the liquid inside glowing faintly. Without hesitation, he applied it to the wound, and a searing burn tore through her nerves like fire. Nia let out a sharp hiss, her fingers digging into the stone floor. "God, Lorran, what the hell is that?" "Sealant compound," he said, his voice maddeningly calm. "Serkthari medical grade. It will stop the bleeding, but the pain is unfortunate." "Unfortunate," she gasped. "You could have warned me." "Would it have changed anything?" he asked, his eyes flickering up to meet hers. She tried to glare at him, but couldn't hold it. There was something in the way he was looking at her, something raw. She forced herself to breathe. "No, but it would have been polite." "Humans and their obsession with politeness," he muttered, shaking his head. But there was something softer in his voice now, something barely perceptible. The silence between them stretched. She could still hear the distant echoes of battle beyond the corridor, but in this space, with only the dim blue glow of the conduits illuminating them, everything felt strangely still. Then Lorran spoke. "You were right." Nia frowned. "About what?" He looked at her for a long moment, as if struggling with something. "About hesitation. I have spent my life believing that emotion weakens judgment, that to care for someone, was a vulnerability that could be exploited." She held his gaze, barely breathing. "But in that moment," he continued, his voice quieter now, "when I saw you in the line of fire, when I saw you falling, I felt something I cannot name." He exhaled, as if admitting it cost him something, and it was unbearable. Nia's chest tightened, though she wasn't sure if it was from the pain or the way his words wrapped around her like a confession. "Lorran." Before she could finish, a sudden impact against the corridor door sent a jolt through them both. The purists had found them. Lorran was on his feet instantly, his weapon drawn. "Stay behind me." "Not a chance," she shot back, already pulling herself up despite the pain. His expression flickered with something unreadable, but there was no time to argue. The door shuddered under another blow, then another, until finally, with a deafening crack, it gave way. The purists poured in, 3, 4 of them, their weapons raised. But Lorran moved first. He was lightning, a blur of calculated violence, his blade cutting through the air with a lethal grace that left no room for counterattack. The first soldier fell before he could fire. The second hesitated just long enough for Nia to drive an elbow into his throat, wrenching the weapon from his grasp and firing before he could recover. But the third and fourth were faster. Lorran twisted, blocking a strike aimed for his ribs, but the other soldier raised his blaster, aiming directly for Nia. She felt time slow, the weapon's energy core lighting up as the trigger was pulled. And then Lorran was there. The shot never reached her, because Lorran had stepped in front of it. The blast struck his shoulder, sending him staggering back, but he did not fall. With a growl of pain, he turned the motion into an attack, cutting down the final soldier before collapsing to one knee. Nia rushed to him, her own pain forgotten. "Lorran, I am unharmed," he said through gritted teeth, but even as he spoke, dark violet blood trickled down his arm, staining his robes. "You're a terrible liar," she muttered, already ripping fabric from her sleeve to press against the wound. His breathing was uneven, but he did not push her away. Instead, his fingers curled briefly around her wrist, whether to steady himself or to reassure her, she wasn't sure. "You shouldn't have done that," she whispered. He exhaled a faint laugh, though it was strained. "That is what you said to me." She swallowed hard, her pulse hammering in her ears. "Because it's true. You're too important to this treaty, to your people." His fingers tightened around hers. "And you are important to me." The words stole the air from her lungs. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The battle outside still raged, but in this moment, in this ruined corridor, nothing else existed but them. Then, finally, Lorran spoke again, his voice quieter, but no less firm. "I will not lose you, Nia." Her throat tightened. She had spent so much of her life arguing for the power of emotion, for the strength in feeling. But now, as she looked at him, at the man who had risked everything he had been raised to believe for her, she found herself at a loss for words. So instead, she leaned in, pressing her forehead against his. It wasn't a kiss. Not yet. But it was a promise. The war was not over. The peace they had fought for was still uncertain. But this was something undeniable. And whatever came next, they would face it together.